In the 1980s and the early 90s, Omaha, Nebraska and Des Moines, Iowa seemed to be hotspots for the disappearance of children. It was a scary time because kids started to vanish while they're out doing things children are supposed to be doing, like riding a bike on a hot summer day or delivering newspapers. Johnny Gosch is just one of the many kids from that part of the country who went out of their homes and never returned. He wasn't the only missing paperboy in Iowa. He wasn't even the only missing paperboy who delivered for the Des Moines Register. Because the local police department seemed to be either incapable or unwilling to find Johnny Gosch, his parents hired a team of their own private investigators who followed every lead they could get. Still, the trail appeared to have grown cold. It wasn't until 1988, a full 6 years since Johnny had last been seen, when they got a huge break in the case, as a lurid and mysterious scandal began to develop in nearby Omaha, Nebraska.
It's a web of intrigue that starts in our Holy of Holies, Boys Town, Nebraska, one of the most respected institutions in the United States, and spreads out like a spider web to Washington, D.C., right up to the steps of the nation's capital, the steps of the White House. Involves some of the most respected and powerful and richest businessmen in this United States of America. And the centerpiece of the entire web is the use of children for sex and drug dealing and drug couriers, the compromising of politicians, the compromising of businessmen, but worst of all, the corruption of key institutions of government that have the duty and responsibility to make sure these things never happen.
That was John DeCamp describing what became known as the Franklin Credit Union scandal and later the Franklin cover-up scandal. Let me explain. This case started out as your run-of-the-mill investigation of missing money, $40 million to be exact. And then the case kind of turned into this hideous thing all about the dark and perverted world of child abuse and drug dealing and even satanic rituals. Everybody that was involved seemed to be protected by very powerful figures in politics and business. And it turned out to be a very dangerous case to investigate. From late 1988, when the case first broke open, until mid-1991, when they shut it down, at least 15 people associated with the case, either investigators, alleged perpetrators, or even potential witnesses, died sudden and sometimes violent deaths. Welcome back to another episode of Invisible Ships. Tonight we're going to continue our discussion about what happened to Johnny Gosch, and we're going to be talking about another case that was breaking around the same time that has a lot of relevance to what could have happened to Johnny. Just want you to be aware though that there's going to be some pretty dark stuff that we're going to be discussing. This case has to do with ritualistic satanic abuse, and it's upsetting to say the least, so listener discretion is advised. In Johnny Gosch's hometown of West Des Moines, they seem to have a problem with paperboys disappearing.
This is the corner, Southwest 14th and Highview, where the newspapers Eugene Martin was delivering were found. It's believed Gene Martin was abducted.
Johnny Gosch was not the only paperboy to be abducted. In fact, he wasn't the only paperboy that delivered for the Des Moines Register to turn up missing.
Gene is still missing, and police really don't know any more now than they did then.
As far as finding out what happened to him, making an arrest, about the first day, we knew as much as we think as we do know now about what actually happened and who did it.
There are those who say it's going to happen again, just like it happened to Johnny Gosch and Gene Martin. A kid will just be gone, without a trace. Beverly Fisher, 5 TV News.
Don't you think it's a little coincidental that two newspaper delivery boys in the same town were both abducted, never found, no body, no nothing, and just disappeared? They vanished off the face of the earth.
Yeah, and I also think it's coincidental that the police just kind of were not being helpful in investigating these cases. You know, Johnny's case started to stall out, and there just seems to be a recurring pattern in all the cases that we are looking at in this kind of vast conspiracy, that the police always seem to find a way to just kind of not thoroughly investigate these cases. Like, for example, just after Johnny's disappearance, Noreen spotted a story that had been published in September of 1982 about 2 Des Moines girls who had been forced into prostitution in Omaha, Nebraska. So obviously this was days after Johnny disappeared. She connects the dots and calls Orville Cooney, who is the chief of the West Des Moines Police Department, and he just refused to investigate any link. He just would not even humor the idea. So he stonewalled her right away, which led to Noreen calling a press conference to make her story public, and it ultimately resulted in the Gosch family receiving death threats where they were warned to stop making waves, and she gave up on the police department and hired her own private investigator, who ended up, over the course of time, hiring a few different private investigators.
That's really bad. You cannot defend the police department on this. They seem to have stymied every effort to find this kid and the other boy too. And, when the parents are looking for Johnny Gosch, the way that the police seem to just kind of stymie every effort, waste every lead, it's no wonder that the parents decided to just go ahead and hire their own private investigators. I blame a lot of this on the chief of police in West Des Moines and how he acted so indifferently towards the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. It was like he didn't want him to be found.
Yeah. Well, we already talked about he jumped on the picnic table with a bullhorn and told everyone to stop searching. It was just a runaway.
Yeah. He was drunk. He got up on that picnic table, told all the volunteers that the Gosches had assembled to help them find their son to go home. The kid's nothing but a damn runaway. And look at that today. Like, imagine if this happened now, hopefully, there would be Amber Alerts and an all-out manhunt for the car that reliable, credible witnesses said they saw. Not just the paper boys, but a 40-year-old attorney that was coming forward with information that it witnessed the car talking to Johnny. And here we get nothing. We get this real laid-back, wait-and-see approach. But I think there's more. I think that somehow, somewhere, there was corruption in the police department. But when you're talking about how Noreen Gosch found out about those girls that were kidnapped and that were forced into prostitution in Omaha, everything about this story for a while now is going to center on Omaha. Because there was some dark stuff there, and it's kind of the dark center of the story for a while is going into Omaha. And I think you know what I'm referring to when we're talking about Omaha, right?
Yeah, you've got to be talking about the Franklin credit scandal, right? The Franklin Credit Union scandal.
Yep. About 6 years after Johnny was disappeared, all hell breaks loose. It's a hurricane of scandal blowing up in Omaha. What do you know about the Franklin Credit Union scandal?
Well, at first glance, it looks like kind of the run-of-the-mill embezzlement scandal that unfortunately happens at financial institutions. It was a credit union run by an up-and-coming Republican in Nebraska. His name was Lawrence E. King Jr. Real interesting guy. Lived a very lavish lifestyle. It's strange. It's kind of hard to find any pictures of him, which if you're wearing your tinfoil hat starts to get you thinking. And especially won't find any pictures of him with any politicians. But he was a rising star in the Republican Party. Like I said, he actually sang the national anthem at the Republican convention in 1984. But people, the IRS especially, took notice of his lavish lifestyle, and he was audited and ended up going to court for embezzlement. But during the time of the trial, some much darker rumors and accusations started coming out against him involving basically sexually molesting and hurting young children.
Yeah, and before we get into that darker side of him, when you say lavish lifestyle, I think if you don't know anything about this case, that's a giant underestimate. I mean,
Yes.
Like when you really hear about how he lived, and that's what I like about this case, is just that there's so many twists and turns to it, and there's so many larger than life, fascinating characters, and he definitely was one of them. He's kind of, would you say, not your stereotypical Midwestern Republican to begin with, right?
And when you say larger than life, he truly was, and he was truly large. I don't know exactly how tall he was, but he's always described as very tall. He had a really nice goatee that kind of just framed his mouth. Really big. He's very flashy dresser. And there was actually an article in the Washington Post from this time period when the trial was actually going on before it was resolved, and they said, basically, you could say he could stretch $1. He had 2 apartments in Omaha and a place in Washington, D.C. His Omaha penthouse had $50,000 just in furnishings. He actually had to rent a crane to bring his custom-made couch into his penthouse. So when you have to rent a crane to get a couch into your penthouse, you're doing okay. And the funny thing is, he was only supposed to be making a salary of $16,000 a year, but he had a Mercedes-Benz worth $70,000. He had a Cadillac, spent about $10K a month on limousine service, and
$10,000 a month.
And there was an especially fragrant 13-month time span where he spent about $146,000 on floral arrangements.
These are 80s numbers. I mean, think about what inflation is now. That's a lot more money. I mean, that was a ton of money in those days, especially on a $16,000 a year salary. But this guy he's a black Republican. He was part of the National Black Caucus for the Republicans. He was, by most accounts, homosexual. There is a lot of evidence to support that he was a drug dealer. And he's involved in a whole lot of weird stuff that kind of comes out later. He was connected kind of high up in the Republican Party, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, I mean, like it was mentioned, he had that place in Washington, D.C. He was vice president of the Black Republican Council, the National Black Republican Council. He would hold events before like the Republican conventions. I think he actually sang at two of them. He for sure sang at one of them. So
he did. He sang at 84 and 88.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chair now recognizes Lawrence King, Jr., a member of the Nebraska delegation, for the singing of the national anthem.
Yeah.
And he had a pretty good voice.
He did. A little froggy, kind of deep, but a pretty good voice. But so when you hear the crazy, I shouldn't say crazy, but when you hear some very detailed and scandalous allegations against him, and the name dropping of some really the highest level of politicians, you can't outright discount it. Because it'd be one thing to say, oh yeah, Bob Smith took me to a party and George Bush was there. But Bob Smith has no connection at all, so you just don't care. But when you say Lawrence King took me to a party where there was sexually abused minors and George Bush was there, we know that Lawrence King knew George Bush, at least enough to meet, you know?
Yes. Well, they can't totally wash their hands of him and pretend like he was somebody that they didn't know. He was at, like you said, he sang at both of the conventions. He was at a lot of different functions for both Reagan and Vice President Bush. And he was known to have his parties on his house in Embassy Row, D.C., where there would be high-ranking members of the Senate and Congress from both parties. So it's not just a Republican thing. There were Republicans and Democrats, all kinds of powerful people in his circle that he was connected with. When they questioned his landlord, because he did not just have, like we said, he had 2 apartments in Omaha. And the guy that was renting him the penthouse, he said later on, that he couldn't figure out how this guy had so much money, but that he name dropped all these powerful people. So he just figured that he was extremely well connected. He was also probably paying for apartments for other people that kind of came out. And not to go too far onto this story, I'll just drop a little bit. There was a guy that was going around trying to take photos of kids, and he ended up being pretty inappropriate and probably producing illegal pornography with kids. But it turned out that this guy, Lawrence E. King that we're talking about, was paying for his apartment. And there's so many seedy people that he was connected with. But Lawrence E. King was a man that was pretty well known to children. One of the first clues that this guy King was involved in a lot of darker stuff came from a teenage girl. We're going to call her Nellie. And Nellie was adopted by a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Webb. The Webbs were pretty close friends with Mr. King, and that could kind of explain how they were able to live a lavish lifestyle too. So not just Lawrence E. King is living way above his means, but so were the Webbs, because the Webbs made about the same amount of money, and they had a $21,000 chandelier in their house. So it was well over Mr. Webb's annual salary just in chandelier.
You know, all this information that we kind of have about Nellie and her sister Kimberly gets mentioned too, which they were the adopted children of Mr. and Mrs. Webb, who were friends with Lawrence E. King. And there's allegations that Lawrence E. King paid them kind of for use of the children. But all this information that we are both referencing comes from a book by John DeCamp called The Franklin Cover-Up, Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska. And he has interviews with the Nebraska Department of Social Services with
I'm glad that you brought Mr. DeCamp up because I wanted to talk about him too. So he's not just a nobody. He was a state senator in Nebraska. He was a Republican. So a lot of the people he implicates in his story are Republicans, and he doesn't have a political motive to do it. He was also high up as a deputy assistant to the director of the CIA for years. He's a well-connected guy, and he ended up becoming an attorney, and he was passionate about trying to stop these kids from disappearing and realized that they had a real dark problem in his state, and he tried to fix it, and he did the best he could. But this poor girl, Nellie, was adopted by the Webbs, like you said, and she was both physically and sexually abused by her adopted family, which is a tragedy. Started when she was 9 years old. She said that Mr. King, Lawrence E. King, would sometimes call the Webbs and invite Nellie or her stepbrother Joey to parties that he was hosting at Girls Town. Now, Lawrence King was on the board of both Boys Town and Girls Town in Omaha, Nebraska. So he would call the Webbs and tell them to have one of the kids ready in a few minutes, and he would show up and take these kids to the functions. And these parties were not probably what you would imagine a Boys Town or Girls Town would be hosting as a party. It wasn't just punch and pizza and movie night. There was drugs and alcohol at these parties, and there were adults, a lot of strange adults at the parties, and a lot of times there were also prostitutes.
And just to be clear, this is at Boys Town and Girls Town, which is a Catholic, basically kind of orphanage, but really nice center for youth without parents.
Mm-hmm.
And they're having drugs and sex parties there.
Yeah. Something that was supposed to support the kids and help them was unfortunately being totally misused.
Allegedly.
Yeah, I mean, that was the mission, right? That's the stated mission of Boys Town and Girls Town, to help these kids.
Yeah, well, I mean, allegedly they're abused.
True.
I don't want to get sued. You can say what you want.
No, you're right, but we're going to tell the story the way that she is telling it, but it's alleged. So Nellie, and there's another girl named Kimberly, said that at these parties they would meet other children, boys from Boys Town. And the girls were able to pick out some of these boys by looking at Boys Town yearbooks from 83, 84, and 85. One of the boys, she couldn't identify any of the books, but it actually helps to corroborate her story because he had quit Boys Town, but he was still connected with King. So that's why he didn't show up in any of the yearbook photos.
That's going to be Brent, right?
Yeah. Brent. So, but I think that adds some credibility to her story. They're not just pointing in a yearbook and making up people.
Brent's a name to remember, though, because he's involved in one of the most scandalous of the allegations.
That the midnight call boys at the White House?
Yeah, that would be the one.
And
I'll wait till we get to it.
Okay. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but you need to stay with this because there are a lot of crazy developments in the story. So Brent was flown from city to city, sometimes on Larry's private plane. The guy that made $16,000 had a private plane, and he would take this kid Brent to places, and who knows what they were doing. But at these parties, there were prostitutes, and sometimes there would be about 20 kids total. The men would drink and do drugs, and sometimes when they felt ready, they would take out a $50 or $100 bill. They would whisper something to Mr. King, and then he would go upstairs or to some other part of the house with one of the children. Nellie and Kimberly, both said the prostitutes told them to give half of the money to Larry, and they could keep the other half. Larry was pretty generous, especially to the boys, and a lot of people that know about Larry King said that he had a very unhealthy interest in some of these younger boys. So he would buy some of them cars and throw them lavish parties too. But this girl, Nellie, talks about how the sexual activity in this parties wasn't always even behind closed doors. Like sometimes they were doing it right out in front of them, and there'd be couples engaged in both like heterosexual and homosexual sex. And it has to be insane.
Yeah.
Especially at a place that is supposed to be a safe haven for kids.
It boggles the mind to think, is it now? I will be quick to say that I don't think everybody at Boys Town, Girls Town, because they're still active today. That's still a thing. I don't think they're all involved in this satanic child molestation cult. that we're going to be discussing.
No.
But it boggles the mind how many of them there must be to buy off to get in to be able to do this. Or just enough people to look the other way because he's so powerful. It's astounding.
Yeah, and the way that I was approaching the story, Dan, was I didn't really think of this as being necessarily an indictment on them. It seems like a particular chapter was hijacked by some evil people. That's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. And at this time and place in Omaha, it was allegedly completely hijacked by some evil people with some really messed up mindset.
Yeah. Although I'm not going to ignore the reality that there is a very public child sex scandal in the Catholic Church that was broken by the Boston Globe. So,
True.
You know, we're not accusing everybody, but there's some suspicious patterns in all of this stuff, and there's all these connections to some type of national kind of ring.
And I think that you raised a good point too. So if you wanted to just dismiss this out of hand and say that these kids are liars, just like you mentioned, think about that. You know, that Boston story proved that there was a lot of sex abuse and a lot of cover up, and that people that could have stopped it knew about it and they actively hid it. So that may be what was happening here too, that somebody could have stopped this, but they chose not to. But Nellie,
I think sorry, but I just must say, I do think in some ways there's a connection between those stories. And that was just kind of just imagine this story was told, I think, a decade before the Boston Globe broke, or maybe 2 decades before the Boston Globe broke the Catholic Church story. And they were all treated the same way. Just, that's crazy. That couldn't happen. That's crazy. There's no way it could be that widespread. And then finally, one group of journalists decided to look into it and break the story open. So it lends credibility to this story.
let's move on. This guy, Lawrence E. King, or we'll just start calling him Larry King because he's referred to that as a lot of times as Larry King, but he's absolutely not the Larry King that hosts a talk show. It's a totally different Larry King.
But it's funny if you picture him that way. I'm sorry. Yeah. No, I'm sorry.
This dude, Mr. King, Larry King, Lawrence E. King, is a freak. I mean, he was married, but I think he had a lot of crazy extramarital stuff, including with allegedly younger boys and just a lot of weird taste in the bedroom, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of allegations against him. If you have a chance to watch the documentary Conspiracy of Silence that was produced by the BBC, and it was originally supposed to air on the Discovery Channel, but right before it was supposed to premiere, they mysteriously pulled it. But it's out there on YouTube, you can watch it. And they interview a couple of the alleged victims, and the one guy said Larry would basically drug him up and make him do so many crazy things, including poop on him. And it's just so disturbing. So if you believe the allegations, Lawrence E. King just basically liked to, I think it had a lot to do with power with him. Like, he just liked to have sex with whoever and whatever he wanted. There's some foul things that I just don't even want to talk about that they say he did. But the craziest thing, a lot of times, he would be at a party with national political bigwigs, and go upstairs, rape somebody, and then come back down and keep doing the party. Allegedly.
And just like nonchalantly after a rape, come back downstairs and look for the hors d'oeuvres or whatever. Yeah, this dude was crazy. He was weird. He was a bad guy. But he took the girl, Nellie, so she's a teenager, the one that was being abused by the webs and everything. He took her and his wife and his son, Prince, on trips to Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C., starting when Nellie was 15 years old. She actually missed like 22 days of school due to these trips. She was taken along under the guise of being Prince's babysitter. She claims to have met Vice President Bush, saw him at some of the parties that Larry hosted at his home in D.C. At some of the parties, Nellie says it was all just a bunch of guys, and George Bush would sometimes attend. So it would be older men, like the high powerful politicians, mixing with young guys in their 20s. Nellie also said that she had seen sodomy committed at these parties. At other parties during Larry's trips, Larry had the local prostitutes come in their 20s and 30s to entertain his male guests. And at these parties, Nellie said that every guest had a bodyguard and some of the men were wearing guns. She said all the guests had to produce ID and run it through a machine to verify that the guest was who they said they were and that they were actually invited. All the guests were frisked down before entering the party. And, you know, George W. Bush comes up in another part of the Franklin affair when we're talking about the midnight call boys, right? So
And-
we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we keep kind of dancing around
Right.
the midnight call boys.
And also, I don't want to get way ahead of ourselves, but it's not just coincidental to me that it's President George H.W. Bush and not Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, once the head of the CIA, a member of Skull and Bones, he's as connected to the weird ritualistic magic stuff as anybody.
He's into that evil CIA bullshit, for sure.
He is such an interesting character.
And you know what else is weird is, Dan, if we're kind of playing with the idea that Jeff Gannon could be Johnny Gosch after he'd been molested and MKULTRA and everything later on, like, it would make sense that they would pull him out and use him as a little prop to help baby Bush at a press conference. You know what I mean?
Right.
And don't forget that Jeff Gannon was working as a highly paid prostitute for Washington's elite right before he was made to pose as a reporter at the White House.
And it's not like George H.W. Bush wasn't still around. I mean, he just recently died.
Yep.
So who knows? I mean, I bet he was, even like from a totally non-controversial standpoint, I'm sure he called in favors and stuff to help his son have a better time of it as president, because he had all the connections. So I would not be surprised at all if the Jeff Gannon connection came from the Bush family needing some help.
And going back to saying allegedly, if any of this stuff is allegedly true, then I hope that Bush is in hell, because this is some evil, dark stuff. And this was all reported by Nellie to child welfare people, and the child welfare people reported it to law enforcement agencies. By March of 1986, there was plenty of paper trail that she had given to the child welfare agencies and they had given to the police. And the police or the FBI or whoever gave any cared at all about kids could have looked into this. Like the diplomatic security service logs, which are what she was describing when the guests come in and show their information and swipe it through the machine that she was talking about. Those logs could have existed. They could have been subpoenaed. They could have done something about this, but they didn't. The law enforcement officials, just like with Johnny Gosch, just like in that little town of West Des Moines, they failed to pursue any leads or follow any clues to do anything that could have helped these kids. They chose not to. They could have stopped this, you know? It's upsetting. Every time I read about this or hear about it, I get upset because that's bullshit.
I know, I agree.
They allowed the trail to go cold.
I did want to mention, though, you know, that's not the last time that George Bush's name comes up in this story. And it's also one of the allegations was at a D.C. party that George Bush was at is that he paid, I forget this sum of money he paid to take Brent, that boy that Nellie knew, and do who knows what with him. So that's one of the allegations about the president or the vice president at the time.
Now would probably be also a good time to mention that there is a picture of George Bush Sr. as a younger man. It's clearly a picture from the late 80s or early 90s at some kind of function that he's wearing a suit and tie. It looks like a formal function. And in the background, there's a kid that looks strikingly a lot like Johnny Gosch. He would have been about 13 or 14 by the time the picture was taken. Kid's unidentified in the picture, but whoever the child is in the photo, he looks a whole lot like Johnny Gosch.
And that's the age Johnny Gosch would be at that time.
Yeah,
Really,
he would be about that age at that time. Yeah. And you know, like, so if you add that up, it kind of makes sense in a weird, twisted way that these boys that were kidnapped from West Des Moines were never found dead or anything. Like a lot of child abductions end up with a body found somewhere at some point. And we didn't find that. We just found kids that completely vanished. We know that this character, Jeff Gannon, is using a fake name. I'm not saying, we're saying that this is all alleged. I'm not. Jeff Gannon does not admit to being Johnny Gosch. He says he's not, but it just kind of makes sense. I mean, if it was him, if he was kidnapped and used in this kind of child prostitution and had this traumatic stuff happen to him, and then later on we're going to introduce some MKUltra characters that were floating around on the outskirts of this, working as a prostitute in later at years, living in DC area. Like, it all kind of, in a weird, twisted way, starts to add up. But what we keep seeing over and over again is that nobody that could do anything about any of this stuff cares to look into it. The county prosecutor back for Nellie's case, where she lived, was a guy named Patrick Tripp, and he also seemed to not believe Nellie. He called her a liar, even though she passed 4 lie detector tests. Nobody was indicted. So the parents that adopted her, the Webbs, they went free. Larry King got invited back to sing the Star-Spangled Banner a second time at the Republican National Convention in 1988, and that was kind of the end of her saga. But now we're about to get into something that's a whole lot weirder that involves Lawrence King, and they're called Power Meetings with Satan. And this is where it's going to get pretty dark. We're going to be discussing some of the claims of ritualistic satanic abuse. I think there should definitely be like a listener discretion warning here.
Yeah, some of this stuff is bad. Doing the research for this one and reading all about this and listening to this, it just puts you in a dark mood. So if you're sensitive to this stuff, or I think pretty much everybody is sensitive to this stuff, you might not want to listen for a couple minutes. But also, some of this I think we'll just kind of give the broad strokes of what's going on. If you really want to know the nitty-gritty details, it's the Franklin cover-up by John DeCamp. He lists everything, and it's just some real disturbing stuff. So we'll get to it as we talk.
So what we're talking about is more kids now. More kids have stepped forward, and these kids were brave. They passed polygraphs. They were interviewed by child psychologists who were initially skeptical of their claims. So they didn't come in with bias in favor of believing these kids. They actually kind of had the opposite, where they were prepared not to believe what they were saying. But after hours and hours of interviews and interviews with the authorities and stuff, a lot of the child psychologists involved came to believe that these kids couldn't be making this stuff up, that what they're describing actually happened to them. That didn't stop the local newspaper, though, the Omaha World-Herald, from trying to cover for King and his buddies. They ran a headline titled "Satanism, Lots of Talk, Little Proof," and they said the problem was not an epidemic of satanic abuse, but rather America is witnessing an epidemic of concern over Satan and his minions, belittling it, especially among adherents of fundamentalist Christianity. So they just completely try to call these kids liars. And you told me something really interesting about the Omaha World-Herald.
Well,
what was that?
When the Franklin kind of party scene started up alongside the scandal with the sex parties, they said there was 3 ringleaders to it. One was obviously Lawrence King. One was a guy named Alan Beer, who was a department store millionaire in Des Moines. And then the third person was a man named Peter Citron, who was the celebrity columnist for the newspaper there, the World-Herald. So there is a connection there.
How many celebrities are in Omaha? I'm sorry. I don't know why they would have a celebrity columnist in freaking Omaha, Nebraska, but
the world
go ahead.
Headquarters of steak. I mean, there's probably a lot of celebrities there. And this Peter Citron guy ended up getting arrested for sexually molesting 2 children. So, he's definitely, if someone's going to be involved in these type of strange sex parties, it would be him. So I don't know who wrote the article that you're referencing, but you and I have discussed too that if one of the purposes of, because that's the thing that always just gets my goat on this thing. It's like, what is the reason for all this other than just like illicit pleasure of just depraved people? But like, I think part of it is to get compromising photographs and blackmail on politicians. And then if your scheme starts to get out there in the press and it's too late to kill the story, the next best thing is to make the story look silly and kind of flood the market with so many similar stories as disinformation that it kind of gets tuned out and can be brushed off as the satanic panic. And I kind of think that they might have been playing defense there because the story was starting to get out. And going back to your your rule of dark magic that you mentioned in one of these episodes, where they have to make it known that they're doing their trick on you. It just kind of
that was Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
Aleister Crowley has something called lesser magic, and magic doesn't work unless you tell the people that you're doing it.
So who knows what type of, maybe it's a mass initiation ritual and they need it out there. I know that's just crazy talk, but who knows?
As you study this case, you're already knee deep into some crazy stuff, and there's more coming down the pike.
I've been thinking about Nebraska. Like, why is it so weird? Why does it keep coming up? And there is that Offutt Air Force Base that has ties to MKUltra, which we'll get to. But I was also thinking, like, if you were trying to traffic humans across the country, Omaha, Nebraska isn't exactly dead center, but it's pretty
It's
close
just
to
about.
Yeah. Especially, it's a little further to the east, but there's more population to the east, and there's, less until you get kind of over the Rocky Mountains out west. But,
And it's a manageable size, so it's easier to control the media there, and it's easier to control the local politicians. I mean, probably a lot harder to do it in Chicago or New York or LA if you wanted to own all the media and control it. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
And just like you're dealing with in Omaha, I don't know how many cops are on the police force, but definitely not like NYPD or something where it'd be easier to manage them, keep the detectives from being on the right trail, or shut down investigations that you don't want to see come up.
Sure.
It kind of would make sense.
I mean,
in a weird way that they would choose that.
I'm pretty sure it's about 500,000 people there, but it's like Milwaukee size. But still, it probably would be easier to kind of get to know the right people more quickly. Who knows what it is? It's just really, it's just weird that it keeps coming up.
And I had no idea how weird Omaha was. And there was also at this time a real exclusive club for the top people in the city, like the county commissioners and the mayor and stuff like that. And they had these weird photos at the release of their club of them all dressed like Egyptian women and dressed in weird ritualistic costumes and stuff. I mean, Omaha was creepy and weird, especially in the 80s and 90s. I don't know what it's like now. I always thought of Omaha as just being like a boring corn place. There's also was a girl that was named Loretta Smith, and she claimed that she was also at some of these King parties, and that King would hold parties again at the North Omaha Girls Club, where the leaders, both men and women that were leaders of the club, were engaged in the photography of nude children. She listed doctors and lawyers, and she said that they all were using code names, and that she couldn't get any of the real names of the individuals. She says that the adult leaders who took the photos used threats against her and the others to get them to participate in these photographic sessions because the kids were hesitant to do it. And she said that on multiple occasions, she was told that her entire family would be killed if she refused to participate in those activities.
These take on a bit of a different turn, like you said, from the original Lawrence King. Because Lawrence King was violent and depraved and everything, but I don't remember threats against the families and stuff like that. Maybe the families theoretically were more willing with Lawrence King, but this seems a little bit more organized and violent, and she reported that they were doing satanic rituals as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they would give them something to drink that she said they would say was apple juice, but she thought there was some type of drug in it, and they would give it to her and tell her, get ready, the room's gonna spin, and then she lit.
Yeah, let me set that up a little bit more, because this girl Loretta Smith went to the police, and there was a police report that ended up in the Franklin Commission. It was dated June 30th of 1988. So right at the very beginning of this thing, she talked to somebody named Officer Carmen, and Officer Carmen wrote down a lot of what she said in the report, obviously. And the main gist of it, though, was concerning child pornography, but there's a lot of mention also of this devil worshiping activity that Larry King was a big part of. So in '88, Loretta Smith was put in a hospital for a while because of all this trauma and everything, and she trusted her doctors and nurses enough that she started to reveal even more details, and the police were interested in that. And she provided a lot of information of this cult activity, including witnessing of homicides of several young children. And again, she mentions Larry King being involved and present during those.
Yes.
On August 19th of 88, the hospital notes indicate that Loretta was asked to give a chronological account of the involvement in what was described as a devil-worshipping cult. And Loretta agreed to do this. And she indicated that she didn't really know what was happening at first because she became very involved very gradually. That kind of sticks out at me. Like, that gives it a little shade of realism.
Yeah, and
I think.
And also, it kind of gives you an idea of sort of how they groom these people. So she was really young at this time, but able to like leave her house and leave these places to go do what she wants. So maybe probably not the most stable home life. And she basically, it sounds like these guys like lured her in, and she kind of thought they were partying, and they started out, they just hang out in like abandoned houses and smoke a joint. And these are all men in their 30s, and she was like 15 or younger. But
yeah, I think it started when she was like more like 10 or 11. So, and the guy, one of the guys you're talking about is somebody named Ray, who supposedly was working for the girls' club in Omaha. And he would take her and other girls on what was called girls' club outings. And one of them was at an abandoned building. So, of course, you're going to take the girls from girls' club on an outing to an abandoned building.
Right.
Because that doesn't sound weird. And they would sit around and talk in an abandoned building, and Ray would give them marijuana joints to get them high. And she said that like they would gradually ease them in like this. So this will go on for a couple weeks where you go to an abandoned building and smoke pot with the leaders from the girls' club, and then you'd start going to parties and stuff with them. And she said at the party there would be about 10 men, all in their mid-30s. And they would sit around. Initially, they wanted to talk to the girls about their problems. And part of that may be to get even more power over the girls and more information from them. But she, Loretta was also saying that as the people got wasted and the men at the party would make them sleep around, and that the girls didn't have a choice of who they slept with. So they were basically being sexually abused and had no say in what was happening. So for a while there, Loretta was done with the girls' club and she stayed away. It's kind of hard to understand why she went back.
It sounded
guess,
like she was a really messed up, through no fault of her own, kid, and kind of thought maybe she wanted to go back. Like, she sounded pretty messed up about it. But then talk about they started taking the girls to what they called power meetings, and they had candles and did weird stuff there, like more ritualistic.
Yeah. So the power meetings definitely sound like now they're getting directly introduced to real Satanism, and like there's black magic and drugs being used. And that's where I think that she was given the drink that you were talking about, that they told her the room was going to spin when she took that drink. Right. This happened a couple months later, after she had been already kind of initiated, smoking pot with these guys, telling them about her problems and stuff. But at one of the power meetings, she was taken to another abandoned building in Omaha, and she was locked in a room with a little girl, which was a little infant. This is hard to listen to, but about midnight, the men came into the room and they took the little girl away and told her that she could achieve as much power as she wanted by killing something she really loved. And Loretta described that they cut the little girl's head off and stuck it on the wall and made her sit in front of it.
Right, and this is where it gets into the stuff that I don't think we need to get to the details, and I think that's so disturbing and horrible. And basically they mutilate the corpse and they do all kinds of weird things, and they try to make her do weird things to it, and when she refuses, they beat her.
Yeah.
And it ends, they left her locked in the room with the girl's body for 24 hours. And during the time, all she could hear were girls screaming in the other rooms. And then shortly after that, they came in the room and told her she passed the test and took her home a couple blocks away and let her out.
And one of the people that she claims that she saw at this satanic ritual murder of an infant was her school principal. Which, I don't know what you would think as a kid, so it would be hard to find somebody that you could talk to.
But if you go along with kind of the theory, it makes, sense. The leaders of the community, they're all corrupted, and who knows how kind of insidious this cult is in the power structures.
And then there's also cannibalism that comes up. I'm not going to go, like you said, we're not going to go deep into the details, but at another one of these meetings, this girl, Loretta, claims that a little boy was sacrificed and that the girls that were there were forced to eat part of his body that was fried, and that the girls were forced to eat it, which is just, it's so messed up. It's hard to think about.
If these claims are true, this cult, because there's no other word for what this is. I mean, maybe cults too organized, but whatever this group was that was doing these satanic rituals, they committed murder, every crime, rape, cannibalism, every disgusting thing you can imagine is alleged here, and they seem to be doing it. They kept saying like they would do it for power, and they would have to kill these things for power, or these kids for power and stuff like that. So it's very messed up, but it does sound like it's not. They at least had some type of a ritual or magic frame around what they were doing. So they weren't just randomly killing people. They had a reason that they thought.
So as these kids, babies and young children are being sacrificed and tortured and stuff, Loretta said that the cult members would wear black clothes with upside down crosses on it, and one of the leaders always had a long black cape with gold rings shaped like a skeleton head, and she said that man was Lawrence E. King, Larry King, the guy that sang the national anthem at the GOP convention. And you know what?
Right.
You know what else? There was an expert from the Foster Care Review Board. Her name was Carol Stitt. And when she had the reports from Loretta's caseworker, she said during the Franklin Commission that the girl's testimony appeared highly credible. And she went before the board on December 19th, 1988. She said, one of the things that you want to keep in mind, as horrifying as this is when you review it, is that this girl is very concrete about who was present at these homicides, what was happening, the date she gave, and a lot of specific information. And in working with children, one of the ways you know that this is not a global fantasy is the more details they give you. The information given to the hospital staff and to the Omaha police by Loretta Smith overlapped and corroborated what was already in the hands of the authorities from the children, from the Webb household, and from somebody else named Margot Giorgio and her daughter. So there's 3 separate cases that were all involving pornography, child abuse, and ritual murder that this girl's details didn't contradict in any way. They corroborated evidence that the authorities already were looking at. And so the Foster Care Review Board and their child psychologists ended up agreeing that this girl was actually telling the truth. And the newspaper of the city and stuff like that, they tried to quiet it down and make it look like these were lying kids and that this was all satanic panic. But there are some reasons that people should look at it and at least do the very basic investigations into seeing if what these kids are saying was true or not. But they didn't.
No, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. That's an expert opinion that just based on kind of the hallmarks that they look for when they take the testimony, because that's part of their job. They're taking testimony from kids, I'm sure several times a year at least. And she said this one stuck out to her as at least being an honest testimony. Now, whether devil's advocate, they were just a traumatized victim that made up memories because she was so young and didn't know what to do with them, or if she's telling the truth. Either way, she felt it was true, and it corroborated information they already had from other children. And like criminal conspiracies of adults have trouble keeping their stories straight.
Yeah.
So for kids to all be kind of saying the same thing.
Even the guys like involved in Whitewater and stuff couldn't keep it straight. And
yeah,
what they're saying too is I read another report from a child psychologist about this, and they were saying that when children make stuff up, they have to have an understanding of what they're making up. And they didn't believe that this girl at this young age could know as much about satanic rituals and things like she did. That the evidence that she gave them, while it's hard to believe that something like this could be happening, it seemed to fit. And I think that might be where we're going to leave this episode. And our next one, we're going to get even closer to Johnny Gosch, because out of this case, there also was somebody named Paul Bonacci that was another kid that stepped forward and reported having been abused and things, and he claims that he was actually present for the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch.
No, that's good.